Good evening from London, and thank you for joining us. This is the third panel discussion of our series, Afghanistan 20 Years. The last one was moderated from Kabul, which feels a very long time ago now. August the 15th feels a very long time ago, but it's been just 1 month since the fall of Kabul and the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. The end of the 20-year war, the end of the democratic experiment, the end of many things for many people of Afghanistan in particular, but also I imagine for many people who are joining us now. I've recently returned from 3 months reporting on the ground in Afghanistan. I worked closely with Afghanistan's Pulitzer Prize winning photographer and my close friend and colleague, Massoud Hossaini, after traveling across the country to cover some truly groundbreaking stories. We were on the last commercial flight to leave Kabul on August the 15th. We're both now in Europe. I'm at home in London. Massoud is in Dordrecht in the Netherlands, and he joins us from there. He's our first panelist, and he's going to talk to us about media coverage in Afghanistan. For some time now, we've been seeing Afghanistan only through the prism of Kabul. Media organizations were taken over and closed down by the Taliban as they advanced across the country. And since they took control, journalists have been detained, beaten and intimidated. And there's now disturbing news of plans to cut internet access. Over to you, Massoud. Welcome and thank you for joining us. You'll have to unmute.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. Hello, all. Greetings from Holland, from Dordrecht. I'm so happy that still I can talk to you, that I could get out of Afghanistan. I escaped the last day. In the weeks ago, we had a lot of information coming from Afghanistan through my friends, which they had to send or talk about those, whatever was going on in Afghanistan by other apps that they're not being followed and tracked. So when I asked them, they said that whenever they captured journalists, local journalists, first of all, they take their smartphone and then force them to open or put the password on it, and then they go and check all the messengers. So if they sent any news or any message to a journalist or to anybody outside of Afghanistan, then they will have a lot of problem and they wiped by Taliban. So also we were witness actually there's several disturbing and graphic photos from the Ettalat Rose newspaper, and several photographers that they were being beaten, wiped by Taliban. After that, they were covering the women demonstration in Kabul. Unfortunately, one of the photographers, really active and really loud in voice photographer in Herat, still is missing. And I tried to communicate with many journalist union around Europe. Well, because they think that they are doing a lot of job right now for Afghan journalists, they either do not answer or they even don't care. But the main problem for this union, I have to just say this and then we go more for the Afghanistan. The main problem for this union is that they think that they know the priorities, which they don't, unfortunately. And that's why that they miss a lot of great dangers for many people, many journalists who are still staying in Afghanistan. So I discovered and I talked to some people yesterday in Mazar Sharif, some of my friends that I am connecting with them every day and talk to them. So the Taliban already ordered officially the Afghan Telecom and Insta Telecom to Sharif that they should pack and gather their staff because they're gonna cut the internet on October. So because Afghan Telecom and Instagram Telecom is a government-related company, so they're, I mean, first to be ordered to cut off all internet connection, and they go. It means that the employees will lose the job and will go home. And then a second development that unfortunately I find out through my friends in Mazar Sharif in Balkh is that a friend of mine who's let's say he's a journalist working, but is also tried to hide himself. So he was going to a national ID center to take his sister's, electronic ID, and he saw that several Pakistani fighters who are, with Taliban, and they do not talk to the other people. They were there, and by the help of another Talib, which was forcing the employees to issue a digital ID for them. So, and also there is a less news coming up right now from Herat. Probably in many parts of Herat, the internet is already being cut or being distracted or disrupted by Taliban. Well, I am trying to understand that what's going on right now in Herat, because one of the second city which will be under a lot of censorship after Kabul will be Herat, because Herat is a city which the journalists and intellectuals have more modern thoughts, and they are kind of like Taliban think or feel that Herat people and Herat culture is much away from their own ideas for Emirat or something. So that would be definitely one of the cities under a lot of censorship and a lot of other suppression for changing again what the Taliban say, changing people and the public again to the right way that they think. So we had another news from Oruzgan, although that it's too difficult to confirm those news from the other cities, because many of the journalists and civil society activists and human rights activists already had to leave or hide themselves. But we had another bad news actually from Oruzgan, like that Taliban kind of execute a journalist who was working for a radio. So I am trying to understand which radio, but I had a communication with somebody, some group in Holland, that they told me that Holland was kind of supporting and funding one radio in Uruzgan. So still we don't know that person who's being killed and was working for a radio is related to which kind of radio or what problem. So apart all of this, many of my friends who are journalists and photographers, they completely are hiding themselves. If Taliban go door by door and ask for journalists, especially those who are working or who were working for foreign media, and then without any like problem or any law or or anything, actually they go inside their house, they start searching, and one of the main item that they start beating them and kind of take them and arrest them is a camera, is a professional camera. That's what I found, that many of they have to they had to bury the camera underground, because when they go to look for the journalists, they find the professional camera, then they try to find laptop or hard drives or computers to see which kind of pictures the person have. So exactly what they did in 90s, they will try to make Afghanistan image free, and then whatever they want, they will do, and they kind of suppress people in any way they want. And in many other developments, one of the things that I really wanted to say here, and I try to say everyone, is that Taliban are really trying to fool international community for the recognition or getting aid or having some kind of like help from the Western countries. And there was a big also there was a big movement outside of Afghanistan in the world, in Europe, in the US and Canada in the last week that I've been witnessed three demonstration for Afghanistan in Holland, only in Holland. And then I covered, actually I followed US, Canada, England, British, and Germany, France, and all around the let's say globe. The only problem is that there is no any organization to bring all this demonstration together and demand one single demands to ask, for example, Taliban accept the human rights and women rights and rights for education and all this. Every of these groups which I followed were talking about one thing. Like the only similarity that I saw between all these demonstrations, none of them were using Afghanistan national anthem at all. So, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Massoud. Some pretty disturbing stories about repression, and we've been hearing some pretty horrific stories about how the Taliban are treating a range of vulnerable people they regard as opponents and enemies. And there's little surprise in the truly disturbing reports with photos and videos of how women in particular are being treated. But the Taliban have arrived, haven't they, in a very different country to the one they took control of in 1996. And many women in particular, in many places, are showing a brave defiance. Heather Barr is the Associate Director of Women's Rights at Human Rights Watch. She's been monitoring and reporting on the situation for many years and watching developments since August the 15th. Heather, in most parts of the world, women have been fighting for their rights, including in Afghanistan, of course, before the Taliban takeover. And it does seem as if we're seeing a spike in violence since August the 15th. But there's also a framing of the story, isn't there, that smacks of a peace versus feminism narrative. You can have security or you can have women's rights. What are your observations of what's been going on in recent weeks?
Thanks so much, Lynn, and thanks for inviting me. Good to see all of you. So women's rights are in free fall in Afghanistan at the moment. So we have to remember that the standard is not whether things are better than they were in 2001 or not. The standard is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which Afghanistan ratified in 2003. And under that convention, the Taliban and anyone else who governs Afghanistan is responsible for ensuring full gender equality. So, we know what's been happening, and Massoud's talked about some of it. Secondary schools are closed across the country for girls and boys, but that seems to be a move that's been made while the Taliban thinks about, what kinds of restrictions they're going to impose, and whether they're going to allow girls to continue to study. Women who teach boys past grade 6 or 7 have been told that they are no longer needed. They no longer have jobs. Many universities are shut. Others are trying to figure out how to deal with Taliban demands that they segregate their students by gender and their professors by gender too. With some exceptions in the health and education fields, women have been told that they should stay home because they're no longer needed at their jobs, or because Taliban fighters can't be trusted not to engage in abuses against them. So interesting that they should be the ones who have to give up their rights because Taliban fighters are behaving in abusive ways. And then, when women tried to talk to Taliban leaders, which they have done in many different parts of the country, they tried to sit down and say, as you said, this is a new country. It's 20 years later. Things have changed. Let's talk about, how you're going to change. It hasn't gone particularly well. And when they felt like they had no option left except to go out in the streets and protest, as Massoud said, the response has been violence and then to ban protests effectively. So you mentioned the media coverage. I think it's been really unhelpful that a few journalists, not that many, but a few, and most of them men, have written about how peaceful and lovely Afghanistan is at the moment, that may be because they had a fabulous road trip to Kandahar down a road that they dreamed about driving down for years, and they took some really great selfies with Taliban fighters. But when half of the population is mostly hiding indoors and terrified that someone may be coming to look for them, or that all of the things that they've worked for and dreamt of are being ripped away from them overnight, it's probably not a situation that those women would regard as being peaceful and wonderful. And I think it's also really unhelpful to think of, there being two types of Afghan women, this sort of urban elite who are very distraught over their rights being taken away, and then this kind of group of rural women who never got any women's rights anyway, and are delighted that the Taliban are back. I just think, there's shades of truth in that, but it's not that simple. There aren't two types of women, and life is much more complicated than that. And it's definitely not a choice between giving up on women's rights or accepting endless war. That's not a real choice, and that can't be a real choice. And then, of course, there's the catastrophic situation that's unfolding financially because of aid being cut off, because of Afghanistan being cut off from the financial system. And that might not seem like a gender issue, but it's certainly going to affect women and girls in some particular ways. Including, likely many of them losing access to education, regardless of what Taliban policy is, losing access to healthcare that they desperately need, losing access to jobs, even if the Taliban will allow them to continue. So that's a really urgent issue. And it's not just about humanitarian assistance, it's about the education and healthcare systems collapsing. And that's something which is looking, like it's already happening in some ways, and it could be a pretty total collapse. So what should the international community be doing? First of all, they have to treat this like an emergency, because this is an emergency. They can't wait around and have some meetings and take some time to think about what to do on the issues about aid and finances. They can't decide to sort of sit back and wait to see what the Taliban's policies are on human rights and on women's rights. The situation's still evolving. The Taliban is still figuring out things themselves, but it's very clear already that many people's rights have been rolled back and violated, and there isn't the luxury for them to sort of wait a few weeks or a few months and see if it gets much worse. So there's a really tricky task ahead of donors. They have to agree on something, which is not something they're particularly good at, and they have to make quick decisions about these issues to do with financial assistance and access to try and halt the crisis that the country is falling further into every day. And then at the same time, they have to also think about what leverage do they actually have over the Taliban. and how can they come together and actually agree on some ways in which they're going to use that leverage to try as best they can to push for some protections of human rights, particularly women's rights. And there are some key moments coming up when that's going to be particularly important. We have the UNAMA mandate coming up on the 17th of September. We have the Human Rights Council, where there's an opportunity to push again for a fact-finding mission on human rights in Afghanistan. And, you know, it would be a real shame to see the international community kind of dither and lose those opportunities. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Heather. The international community dithering, who would have thought? Abdullah Khenajani is our next panelist. He's a former journalist. He was the news director at Television One, and after doing an MA in war studies at King's College in London, he went back to Kabul and became the Deputy Minister for Peace. And unlike many Deputy Minister positions, his post came with political authority and active participation in peace-focused delegations. He saw up close how the Doha Accord narrowed rather than expanded and facilitated the prospects for peace, and how former President Ashraf Ghani was not just an obstacle to peace, but a major cause of the collapse. I'd like to thank you, Abdullah, for joining us, and look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lynne, for your nice words. It's a true pleasure to be part of this conversation today. Let me begin with extending my apologies to everyone and to the people of Afghanistan for being part of a government that disappointed the international community, but also left the people at the situation that Massoud and Weeda were talking about it. I truly feel ashamed of myself and the others who really did. That's the context that I would like to talk today about it. As you have mentioned, I'm sure there has been a lot of conversation, which I had also the privilege to talk with some of the people while I was in Kabul. Michael was one of them. We have been in touch for a long time. So three important issues, I think, is to be discussed today from my view. Firstly, the design of the Doha Peace Accord between United States and the Taliban. My reading from the beginning was that this is a withdrawal deal, and it not only helped the peace process, but also it narrowed down the prospects of reaching a positive peace deal in Afghanistan. If we elaborate into nitty-gritty of this deal, as you all may know, it would be very repetitive to go to details. The design and the architecture of this deal was composing 5 main issues with the sequencing. First was counterterrorism, the second was the US withdrawal, the third one was intra-Afghan talks, and the fourth one was new political settlement, which is going to finish by a comprehensive ceasefire in the country. So from the beginning, the Taliban was benefiting from some of these strategic objectives rather than looking and following a political settlement in Afghanistan. One of the key things that the Taliban has continuously followed through the peace accord, that was the US withdrawal based on the time limit, which they only engaged with the Afghan negotiation team for the sake of engagement rather than reaching to a political deal. And they have been always coming with the maximalist position. They have been always coming with the rigid ideas and propositions that could narrow down the prospects of positive peace in Afghanistan. And I think this design was important from the beginning, because this design didn't allow so much maneuver for the Afghan government and the peace structure in Afghanistan to pressurize the Taliban in order to meet and match the timeline that the United States would like to withdraw from Afghanistan. In the meantime, by drawdown the international forces from Afghanistan, it was very obvious from the beginning that the Americans were losing their hard leverage on the Taliban, while the Taliban has gained more boost in their morale, and they have gained more political legitimacy to become more courageous and confident in the battlefield. So there was no balance between what the process was producing for Afghanistan and international community, and how the Taliban has been taking the advantage of such a design that led to such a disaster today. The second topic that I would like to touch upon is the President Ghani's prospects on the peace process. From the beginning, it was very obvious that his monopolistic competition with the other, not only with the other politicians, but also with the allies involved in the peace process, including the United States, has been problematic. From very first day, he was, for example, uncomfortable the way Ambassador Khalilzad was dealing with the things. He was so much furious on a different stage, the way that Dr. Abdullah and former President Karzai acting into the process, and he was also looking the whole intra-Afghan and the composition of the negotiation team contradicting to his personal views, that he was thinking to have the full authority and full control over the people who was representing on that time Afghanistan. I think that was important because he didn't cooperate from the beginning to the process, while he was using different tactics to waste the time and to bring more fatigue to the process and pressurize not only the international community, but also put the peace structures and the people within the negotiation team in a tougher position that they could not do anything. And of course, it's also worth to be mentioned that in the centralized system of governance in Afghanistan, when a peace structure is not coming from the same governance system, and its autonomy could be also one of the key problems for the president to control it. And we could never make the opportunity and the chance to find a integration of a centralized system over the peace structure that could produce some sort of results and some sort of cooperation and collaboration between different players, specifically the senior leaders in the country. The last issue, I think it was important to look into the lack of the cohesion and corruption within the peace structure. So the peace structure was hugely under competitions of the different players. The peace structure was lacking a vision to reach to the peace in Afghanistan. I have been part of many conversations with different people and inside Afghanistan, senior leadership, including the president and inner circle of him. There was obvious lack of vision. How they're going to be moving forward towards accepting the Taliban as a reality and producing an undesirable outcome for the country. In the meantime, the management of the peace structure had a lot of problems, specifically the peace negotiation team. The people didn't cooperate with each other. The people inside the peace process were exploiting the peace process financially and politically for the sake of more relevancy and connecting with the different players in the region and beyond. And most importantly, President himself does not see anyone to represent him. My last point would be that 3 weeks before the Kabul collapse, for example, he disqualified Minister Stanigzai, who was the head of peace negotiation team in the Doha. In such a situation, I don't think we could have reached to a positive peace deal within the country and under the pressure of the timelines the Americans were pushing. Thank you so much, Lynne, once again.
Yes, and thank you, Abdullah. Failure written into the fabric. It's a great pity. Rory, Stewart, is our next panelist. He's written 2 books about Afghanistan. He walked across the country when it was possible to do so, was the UK's International Development Secretary, and now teaches international politics at Yale University. He observes that the Western Alliance appears unable to develop a light footprint approach to intervention via Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, and now Afghanistan. What needs to change, Rory? And after the disastrous and humiliating experience of the Afghanistan failure, will the opportunity to get it right ever rise again?
Thank you. Huge issues to cover, and I'll try to talk very briefly. But I think the first problem is that we seem to find it very difficult, the US and its allies, to develop a realistic, moderate account of dealing with countries which are fragile, traumatized, and emerging from war. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that we lurch from extreme depression to extreme optimism. And really, the story of Afghanistan is that the impatience about what happened in 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, the light footprint led people to become overambitious, particularly because people were horrified about what was happening in provinces, particularly like Helmand, which were in the middle of these horrifying conflicts. People began to drive an agenda and convince themselves that somehow the international community had the plan, had the resources, and it could somehow solve all these problems. That led to the surge, a surge which really started with the NATO troop deployments of 2005, 2006, culminated with the US in 2009. And naturally, that excessive involvement, that excessive surge in 2009, inevitably then led to despair and total withdrawal. Somewhere in the heart of what it would take to remain engaged in somewhere like Afghanistan, or indeed any other country in the world in which the West wishes to intervene, would have to be an attempt to try to describe what things are really like on the ground. And Heather touched on this a little bit in her presentation, but one of the most troubling things that we're now seeing is that defenders of President Biden at the moment are very, very excited by reporting coming out from very difficult bits of Afghanistan, suggesting that things have improved since the Taliban took over. Probably the most prominent piece is Anand Gopal's piece in the New Yorker, The Other Afghan Women, where, as the other panelists suggested, essentially he tries to present Afghanistan as composed of only 2 things, Kabul and Sangin and Helmand. The truth of the matter is, of course, that yes, in a lot of Loy Kandahar and Loy Paktia, things were horrifying and have remained horrifying for much of the last 20 years. And that's partly because they were very close to the Pakistan border, partly because they were the center of the drug trade, partly because they hadn't had much state function for 40 years, and the warlords that came back in managed to embed themselves very securely in the police and the army divisions and the governor's roles. But this account is completely false to the experience of many people, for example, in Hazarajat, and indeed in many parts of the central and north of the country and in Herat, who, not only people in Kabul, whose lives improved dramatically over 20 years, notwithstanding many of the same challenges, notwithstanding the fact that in many of those areas there were indeed warlords, notwithstanding the fact that there were many traditional social structures in place, notwithstanding the fact that progress was slow. And we need, if we're going to talk honestly about Afghanistan, to find a way of acknowledging that, yes, some parts of the project were partial failures, some parts of the project were successes, and that we're not forced to choose between an idea that there's neither a bubble of success in Kabul and a failure everywhere else, or lapse into the crazy optimism of the generals and the diplomats from 2005 to 2009, or the intense despair displayed by President Biden and Trump in their withdrawal. And this may be relevant, not just for future interventions, but I think also for trying to think honestly about what our options are now in Afghanistan. I mean, centrally, we need to return to realism. We're going to have to, painful though it is, stop pondering why the peace talks went wrong, or stop pondering what Ashraf Ghani did or did not do, or worrying even about the catastrophic and unnecessary decision by President Biden. We have to now try to think about the rather horrifying futures that Afghanistan now faces. One of them is, of course, Taliban control. Another is indeed collapse of Taliban rule into some form of insecurity and civil war. And underlying this is the question of what we do for people in Afghanistan. Essentially, we're facing a humanitarian development crisis. Banking system has collapsed. Payments aren't getting through. Most of the staff with the nonprofits I work with are unable to receive any of their salaries. And of course, all the services delivered, schools, clinics, etc., around the country are basically ground to a halt. And it's very unclear whether we'll be able to keep the water supply and electricity going in many places in Afghanistan. And the problem for the international community is that there are no good options. We've heard some very powerful arguments made for why people would want to sanction the Taliban and put huge pressure on them. What I'm not hearing in this discussion is how those pressures are put on the Taliban while actually allowing some form of humanitarian development assistance to reach the Afghan people. One of the most basic elements of sanctions tends to be prohibition on exports from a country or stopping their access to the government finances. I'm not clear how much leverage we're actually going to have over the Taliban by threatening to do those things. And I'm very clear that doing those things are going to have a very negative impact on many ordinary Afghans. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. I appreciate what you've been saying, especially about sanctions to only making a very bad situation worse. And that seems to be a perfect segue into our next panelist, Weeda Mehran, who's a conflict expert at Exeter University, and her presence with us, as always, is welcome and is especially timely as we're seeing the signs of conflict emerge within the Taliban and between the factions. Weeda, it's complex, it's complicated, and rarely understood. What's been happening? We've heard of the argy-bargy between leaders of the Taliban and the Haqqani, shootouts at the palace, who should take the kudos and the spoils of victory. But that sounds a little bit simplistic, especially as Rory has just said, the humanitarian catastrophe is escalating. What's going on?
Thank you very much. Glad to be here. As usual, I didn't unmute myself before speaking. Well, yes, we hear a lot about fragmentations inside the Taliban, and the most recent one was the friction amongst the Taliban and the what we heard from ARC in terms of Haqqani network and to not getting along well with some of the more pragmatists in Taliban, amongst the Taliban, Mullah Baradar, for example, and hardliners such as Haqqani network, Sirajuddin Haqqani. It seems that the Taliban right now is facing a lot of internal issues. And the mere fact that the Taliban's caretaker cabinet was formed after the ISIS head visiting Kabul, and that also signified some fragmentations inside the Taliban, that trying in an attempt to try to pull the Taliban together and form that caretaker cabinet. And following that, we saw that despite the fact that that the Taliban promised that the government that they would put in place will be inclusive, we saw that it was basically anybody selected on caretaker cabinet of the Taliban are selected based on essentially two main criteria. They're supposed having some level of madrasa education, religious education, and having served with the Taliban as militants. Not much ethnic diversity in the caretaker cabinet. There were 30 Pashtuns, only 2 Tajik and 1 Uzbek, no Hazara, no Shia, and as expected, unfortunately, obviously no women on the cabinet either. About 17 of the 33 cabinet members are on one form or another terrorist list, blacklist, including Sirajuddin Haqqani, who is the current head of the Ministry of Interior. And right after his appointment was announced, a day or two later, FBI increased the reward on his head from 5 million to 10 million. And this is just one of the cabinet members for the Taliban. And that has led to a lot of lack of satisfaction inside the Taliban's group as well. That at the leadership level, we see all of these issues. Then this is in Kabul. Once we actually look at how the Taliban has been functioning elsewhere in other parts of the country, in other provinces, the non-Pashtun Taliban elsewhere in Afghanistan have also been, based on the reports that we get from Kabul, are being sidelined because apparently the central leadership of the Taliban is fearing that these non-Pashtun commanders in other provinces, in Mazar-e-Sharif, for example, in Herat and elsewhere, they fear that these non-Pashtun commanders might actually align themselves with the resistance groups, and they might not listen to the central Taliban leadership. So that's another indication of fragmentation inside the Taliban. And the internal fractions, they keep increasing in amongst the Taliban. And what the Taliban did, which was what the Taliban did prior to and about when they were taking over Afghanistan and when they took over Kabul, they also released a number of other terrorist organizations members from presence in Afghanistan, including TTP, Tehrik Taliban of Pakistan, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and as we saw that these groups, now a lot of them were freely moving around in Kabul, in other cities in Afghanistan, and they, as we saw during the attacks in Kabul, at Kabul airport, they also created security issues for the Taliban as well, undermining the Taliban's ability to provide security in the country. So the Taliban is seeing, on one hand, they try to, by welcoming these other terrorist organizations in Afghanistan who fought alongside Taliban against the Afghan government before and help them take over many cities in Afghanistan, including Kabul. So now the Taliban is facing that difficult question of how to reach that balance. On one hand, trying to keep these other groups from operating and engaging in probably in terrorist attacks, at the same time keeping them satisfied in Afghanistan so they do not revolt against the Taliban and create security challenges, while the Taliban is trying at the same time to actually gain international legitimacy and abide by some of the demands from them by the international community in terms of women's rights, in terms of women's education, women's ability to work. So that is another challenge that the Taliban is facing and is undermining Taliban's ability to govern Afghanistan and provide security. Another issue, and as they were also mentioned by Rory Stewart, the lack of economic opportunities in Afghanistan, the economy of, and there were other panelists also pointed this out, the economic crisis in Afghanistan going on, the banking system is falling, the country's currency has depreciated significantly. Despite all of this, what the Taliban has been doing, implementing the same draconian laws that it used to implement in Afghanistan back in the mid-90s. While on one hand, the Taliban knows that it needs that workforce in Afghanistan, the educated and skilled Afghans who can help Taliban in terms of provision of services, administration services. At the same time, while they do need people to work, at the same time, the Taliban is not allowing, for example, women to work. They've just told women that they cannot work inside offices, outside their homes, and restrictions on women's work employment is put in place with the exception of healthcare system. And the Taliban cannot even provide salaries for the civil servants as well. In many parts of the country, including Herat and with some families and friends that I'm in touch with, they basically told those workers, to civil servants, that they can come and work for free, but there will be no salaries to be paid for them. And if they choose to come and work for free, then there are certain restrictions, certain rules that they have to observe in terms of dress code, in terms of behavior, in terms of what that head of the office, the Taliban person, will tell them to do or not to do. So while the Taliban is talking, the leadership of the Taliban is talking about the issue of Afghans leaving the country, and they've been trying to prevent that directly and indirectly, for the educated, the social capital, the human capital of the country from leaving the country. And they do know that they have the need for this workforce. They are making it extremely difficult for Afghans, men and, well, particularly women, to work and contribute to bring in stability and stability in the country and be of service. So all of these together, we can see that the Taliban is essentially engaging a very self-destructive approach to its own government. Thank you.
Thank you, Weeda. A perfect segue into our next panelist, Michael Semple, who the last time I saw you on a frontline panel, Michael, you said categorically that when, not if, the Taliban walk into Kabul, they would do so hand in hand with Al-Qaeda. That's what's happened, isn't it, Michael? I mean, no one can say they weren't warned, but what are the implications of this apparently symbiotic relationship, not just for Afghanistan, of course, but for the region and for the rest of the world?
Yes, thanks, Lynn, for that, and also, thanks really for all the fellow panelists who've captured parts of the situation. I really particularly enjoyed listening to Weeda's analysis. I think, Weeda, you really have captured what's going on inside the Taliban, and it's important to have voices like yours getting this out, because, as you say, Lynn, that they. Those who anticipated what was happening did not, just simply were not listened to sufficiently, and it's time to correct that. And I can look at all the people on this panel and think the ways in which they were also trying to speak truth to power in the previous years, but there were very, very strong reasons why they were ignored. And I think that those who systematically ignore the people on this panel will face a reckoning, because I think that we have not yet, the world has not yet done a full evaluation of the catastrophic consequences of the policy failure which we've seen in Afghanistan during this year. And yes, I will very briefly say on Al-Qaeda that. Provision of a favorable environment for Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan again will be evaluated as one of the consequences. They providing inspiration to jihadi groups on all battlefronts of the international jihad will be another of those consequences. Destabilization of South Asia from the base inside Afghanistan, starting with Pakistan, ironically, will be another of those consequences. And I'm sure that that Al-Qaeda will be one of the actors involved in that. But on these things, I'd actually like to say that these are all imminent threats, but. I also want to sort of be careful about even what I used to say about anticipating the return of the Taliban to power. I always try to frame that as saying it wasn't inevitable, that if it happened, it would be a function of bad policy. And I still say that up until a really quite a late stage, it was avertible, but we didn't see the policy corrections. And of course, that will be argued about. And I think that that should also be an appeal for good policy now. When we look at what's emerging, so the dialogue between the engagement wings and the isolate wings for how to deal with the Taliban, it's like a replay of debates and approaches of the 1990s. With two positions which failed then and are probably inappropriate now will fail also. So obviously, I'm thinking of of Rory's grand grand picture of how he said that the debacle in Afghanistan is but a microcosm of failure of Western strategy and ability to make sense of what goes on in such countries and to design an appropriate response. So we got engagement, cozy up to the Taliban, and and we'll normalize them and they'll be okay. Didn't work in the 90s, and we can see good, strong reasons why it wouldn't work now. Isolate can end up being sort of what actually ends up strengthening them. So the isolate of the 1990s didn't work either. So I would like to talk about how we can get off to a better start in terms of the new policy making in dealing with Afghanistan. I think the first main point I'd have to say is that, contrary to the way that sort of many people are somehow thinking, this isn't the end point in any meaningful sense. What we're seeing playing out both in Kabul and in Afghanistan's villages, looks different from the way Afghanistan will be in 6 months' time and 12 months' time. Never forget it. This is the start of a new phase in the war. This is not the end of the 20 years war. And it's okay for the US to try and frame it as such. There are political reasons why in a bipartisan way in the US, political leaders have to try and frame it like that, but it does not represent the reality confronting Afghans or the way in which Afghanistan will confront other international actors. Yes, the major battlefronts are temporarily quiet, except for the ongoing slaughter in Panjshir. But in every meaningful sense, the civil war continues. But in reaching the conclusion that this is a new phase and that there is an ongoing global conflict in Afghanistan, I think the first clue is, of course, the political disequilibrium that other colleagues referred to. Vast majority of the population, almost all of the political class, are systematically excluded from power. They have no voice that they can identify with in the administration, and no peaceful route to achieve that. Au contraire, they face a movement whose raison d'etre is based around maintaining a monopoly of power and excluding other voices. Ergo, that is like the definition of disequilibrium. And if I were to get to come up with an idea of what a political equilibrium looks like in Afghanistan, it's a broad-based government that all major social groups feel they have a stake in, and that the region, international community can deal with. That's what an equilibrium looks like. We ain't there yet. So I liked when this is the challenge you gave to Heather in terms of the framing of peace versus feminism. I think making an observation based on what we know about Afghanistan and learning from history, that the war continues, and that the hope for sustainable peace lies in reaching some kind of plural settlement, and acknowledging that there's likely to be different forms of conflict underway until then. That's not inviting Afghans to a civil war. That is an observation of how things are likely to play out, and I think this kind of insight is important to be fed into the next round of policy on Afghanistan. Now, because I've been profiled as a Talibologist for quite a few years now, and sort of feeling that there was a time when feeling like some of our sort of Sovietologist colleagues were wondering, oh well, is this going to be a dying profession? Alas, I would have been so happy if I could have just gone on to work on the environment or something, because Talibology had gone out of demand. But alas, the demand is back. So I have to, but anyway, I do have to make a few observations on them. The first point. Following on from the previous presentations, is this Taliban administration is incredibly fragile, and I think that some of the ideas we've been hearing from Western governments, and even like Filippo Grandi and so on, rushing into Kabul, so that they haven't yet taken into account just how incredibly fragile it is. And with all the well-meaning people queuing up to sort of to lead the engagement charge, really ought to appreciate it's incredibly fragile. There is no internal settlement amongst the Taliban, as we have heard, that they are badly divided over this division of spoils. And that's really like a fundamental characteristic of what's going on in Kabul at the moment. And that they, and I know that several colleagues have talked about sort of the economic crisis, which is also underway and also only starting. The way that plays out for the Taliban is that like they have no money and no plan to get it, and that's really problematic for an incoming administration. And just to put it into to concrete. Just concrete terms, because I know that other people have been writing sort of learned papers on it. I mean, a mate went in to see the new Minister for Water and Power yesterday, and the minister wanted to borrow 1,000 afs because he had no money. I mean, literally. And then when he got to the point, well, oh, that's a funny situation. You've just defeated a superpower, and you need to borrow a fiver. And he said, he just laughed and he said, yes, and the Uzbeks are asking for $200 million or else they're going to cut off the power. That's the situation. And if we're going to try and get a sense of the non-viability, non-sustainability of the current settlement, things that have changed since the Taliban were last in power, is that the massive increase in urban population, doubling of the overall population, massive increase of urban population, massive increase of Kabul. Now imagine Kabul without mains power. It's problematic. Last time Taliban came in after a civil war where particularly the city had been destroyed. This time they came in when there was sort of a functioning emergent economy, and they've just flattened it. So further understanding, of course, one has to mention the idea that's been around there: have the Taliban reformed? The answer is frankly is no. They've changed. They've become a bit more complex. They have not. They've not reformed. I like the reference earlier on that the Taliban have been trying to fool the international community. I think that characterizes really quite fundamentally the part of the political strategy of the Taliban, and also, frankly, the apparent gullibility of many of the international actors who have dealt with it. Sometimes there's a self-serving reason as to why people want to seem to be fooled. But always bear in mind, political stances of the Taliban are largely they're trying to fool someone. We can come up with real reasons as to why there is continuity in the Taliban, although the people on the front line, I mean, they're 19 and 20-year-olds who have no memory of the previous emirate, but there's a continuity in the political culture of the movement which ensures that the fundamental approach of the movement to try and assert a political minority, a political monopoly, and to try and enforce their interpretation of conservative social norms with the emphasis on force. I mean, there is continuity that is passed on through a political culture inside the movement. And I think that actually the more fundamental changes, of course, are the changes in the non-Taliban population. So when we see a different dynamic this time and how it's going to play out differently compared to the Taliban's rise in 94, 96, 98, is actually because they're confronting a very different Afghan population. Those changes are profound. They will prove to be significant in the times ahead. So I mean that the story of a reformed Taliban, it's politically generated. It's not empirically based. I mean, it's to do with meeting the requirements, obviously, the bipartisan mood in the US to provide cover for an irresponsible exit from Afghanistan. So just to wind down, I'd like to just think ahead to how we think ahead, doubling down on this humanitarian diplomacy, engagement, or even the sanctions-based approach. Let's try and isolate would be major problems. I think that the strategic thinker is trying to help to inform policy. Already have to think beyond the current Taliban administration. Do not get the idea that this is the 1,000-year Reich. That they think ahead to the stable equilibrium outcome on which sustainable peace can be based, which is it is an internal settlement which provides a practical manifestation of Afghan pluralism, stake for all the social groups, and acknowledge that even though the major battlefronts, with the exception of parts of Panjshir, are quiet for now, that we know enough about the way Afghanistan is, and also things which are happening now, that there will be political resistance, a national political resistance to the current Taliban administration. There will be civic resistance that they hear across the country. We see the seed that's getting, we can anticipate far more of it, and there will be military resistance, and probably in quite short time, and not depending initially on Western backing. So imagine and then design a peace process. We'll have to deal both with this national resistance and with the Taliban as we see them, a peace process which should build upon the kind of lessons that that Abdullah talked about earlier on, the failures of previous phases. And I think that the essence of that peace process will be engaging with Afghan, not engaging with the Taliban to reform them, engaging with Afghans in their pursuit of a functional Afghan pluralism. And I think it's really important that we get this message out to the emergency policymakers who are not focusing on the big picture. They're not focusing on the future. They're just saying, oh, how can we get the humanitarian assistance, ensure the humanitarian assistance continuing? And I can reassure you, Siraj Haqqani and his henchmen are rubbing their hands saying, how can we capture this process like we have captured so many before? And that the final note is that although I believe that the most likely scenario over a period of time, which don't name the time, is actually progress towards that plural solution. Of course, and I do not think that this Taliban administration will endure. However, there is of course an alternative, which is if the Taliban get more effective at their authoritarianism and therefore sustainably resist the pluralism. That would be a highly undesirable outcome. None of us should contribute towards it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. A lot to think about there. You touched on a lot of points that subsequent panelists are going to also cover. And next up is Greg Barton, who is an expert on global Islamic politics at Deakin University outside Melbourne. Greg, thank you so much for joining us in the middle of your night. There's a lot that you can pick up on what Michael said. It's not a 1,000-year Reich. It's the Taliban maintaining a monopoly on power. Where do we go from here? So perhaps you can start with Taliban 2.0, spot the difference.
Thanks, Lynn. Yeah, where do we go from here? I wish I had any confidence or optimism, and Michael gives me some optimism that well, optimism is maybe too strong a word. We are going to be making a difference in the way we engage, and this is not over. I completely agree that we don't want to double down on cutting off access and thinking that sanctions or any sort of pressure are going to bring about the result that we need. And of course, the immediate concern is the humanitarian disaster in this coming winter. And, it's easy to see how it could be very much worse than it currently is. I think that it is encouraging to see that it's possible that we'll get a change out of this current Taliban regime into something that becomes more plural. I just hope that there's a way of that occurring that doesn't involve conflict. I mean, if there's anything to be glad about with the current situation, it's that we haven't seen artillery rounds and rockets and street fighting in Kabul or other cities. It hasn't been civil war. If we look at northern Syria, we can see how much worse it could be than what it currently is. But of course, if this regime can't get its act together, and if the international community can't find a way to engage with it, then there's going to be a humanitarian disaster. So I'm sort of even unsure of what to wish for or expect. But to answer this question of Taliban 2.0, well, I think we're all in agreement that there is no Taliban 2.0. There's been this dramatic demographic shift in Afghanistan, so the population perhaps almost doubling, and a median age of under 19. And so even the Taliban themselves are mostly born after the previous emirate. And they obviously using smartphones, and there's a consciousness about communication, which transforms the way some of them at least engage. Although if you're looking at the senior leadership at the moment, that's not so evident, which means that there's a veneer of difference. But to frame things in terms of areas where I'm a little bit more expert, the success so far of what the Taliban have achieved, which is military success, based on a political collapse, and we know the backstory to that, nevertheless is read as being a victory for this jihadi long war, that if you persevere long enough and you're on the side of God, then you'll prevail and you can establish some sort of Islamic state, some sort of emirate. I mean, that obviously is hollow if you look at the details, but for many people, it doesn't matter. They want to believe this story. So it has a powerful inspiration effect around the world. I'm conscious of somebody who's worked in Southeast Asia, of how much the problems with jihadi extremism in Southeast Asia have come out of a small group of people who have come back from Afghanistan, the Afghan alumni, so-called, and how transformative that experience was for them, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So across Southeast Asia already, I think there's, not that these groups have much chance to change things because they're rather pinned down, but they're inspired by the sense that in the long run, they'll prevail. I think the opportunities for such groups to prevail most immediately, obviously, is in areas where there's failing governance. So in Mindanao, for example, I think that bodes poorly for what might happen immediately. And of course, across Africa, we already see a situation with both the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda competing to buy into local insurgencies, and what's happening in Afghanistan, the inspiration effect there will be immediately felt. Of course, the other concern, which can be overstated, I know, and we don't know the time frame, is of a return of people coming into Afghanistan and into camps, perhaps with the plausible deniability of the Taliban regime, but nevertheless, it's not going to be any sort of government that has complete control over the country. And it certainly has a deep commitment to its partnership with Al-Qaeda at various levels, particularly on the Haqqani side. And so it's difficult to see how the flow of foreigners who want to study and be inspired and take home ideas is going to be stopped. I mean, to the extent that Pakistan tries to stop that flow, it would be significant. And I suppose if you want to be optimistic, you could say eventually with Syria and Iraq, Turkey was forced to take a bit of a stance on that, but took years and a lot of damage was done, and it's still not something that Turkey's resolved in that conflict, and it's damaged Turkey internally. So I think that the inspiration effect, the flow of people who will call themselves mujahideen, but are really going to be trained and to be inspired and take things back home, is going to be an immediate problem. And I think it's going to be a problem particularly for Pakistan. So despite the delusional euphoria of some in Pakistan, particularly in Islamabad, I think that there's going to be quite immediately problems. Of course, if the Taliban do get their act together, and we sort of kind of wish they would for the humanitarian point of view, then to the extent that they have any sort of semi-legitimacy, there will be many people traveling, and I'm thinking once again as a Southeast Asianist, from Muslim majority states, ostensibly to do good and to try and help. And for some, that'll be entirely the story. For others, there will be some transformation personally or further radicalization, which will be problematic for their home governments, because if your government's recognized and your Taliban administration and you've been dispatched to perform some sort of technocratic role, then you're not you're not a foreign fighter, you're not doing anything illegal, you're doing something that is your state supporting. And there's going to be a large liminal gray space there for people who come and go, presuming that this Taliban administration is somewhat stable and there's some chance of engaging with it, people who come and go and take home a more radicalized view of what can be done back at home in their states. So across South Asia and Southeast Asia, I think this is going to be very problematic. It begs the obvious question about what we do about things. And I I return to the earlier point, which I think we all agree on, that isolating the Taliban administration is no help. If they fall quickly into more violent, open civil war or dispute, then the humanitarian disaster potential is enormous. And the slight good news that we haven't seen open warfare on a large scale will get replaced by something much more grim, as we're seeing now, well, as we hear reported from Panjshir. So we want to try and make them as responsible as we can without succumbing to their narrative, which is, the whole peace process in Doha, so-called, was smoke and mirrors. It was a scam, which it's not time to go into. It's a fairly obvious story anyway. I think everyone understands the story, but it would be foolish to double down on that mistake made over the last couple of years by somehow being suckered into spinning a positive story about this Taliban, and yet somehow we've got to find a way of engaging with them with carrot and stick feedback, so that there's some pressure on them. And I honestly don't know how we can do that, I don't want to downplay the fact that the fate of 38 million or so people depends on what can be made to work. Most won't get a chance to get out of Afghanistan. Most are going to be stuck with the consequences of whatever happens. But it's a bigger story than Afghanistan. It's of consequence to the entire Muslim world. And I don't think when I say we, the global community, has understood how much is at stake. And I certainly don't think the Biden administration has understood how mistaken they've been, thinking that they're closing a chapter on something and that they've reduced their problems, because actually they're walking into something much larger that will create vastly more problems than what they could have had with some sort of minimal transitional arrangement or containment of the problem. But I think all I'm doing is stating the obvious. But for what it's worth, that's a perspective looking beyond Afghanistan and seeing the implications of what's happening at the moment.
Thanks, Greg. Looking beyond is always good. I'm going to turn now to James Glancy, a former Royal Marine who served in Afghanistan, now a documentary filmmaker. You returned to Afghanistan after your service, I think you said, James, because you felt that the country and the culture and the people and the history were understood, misunderstood, and you wanted to get a grip on that. And you've just spent, as I have, a few months there making a film, and also you have an intimate interest in the resistance that we saw emerge in the Panjshir in the weeks after August the 15th. So, and my feeling is that the spirit of the resistance is certainly still alive, but whether there's any flesh on the bones left, I'd be interested to hear your take on that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lynn. And it's great to join such esteemed panelists. Very hard to follow almost all of you. I think I'll just start off to say, I want to come to the subject of Pakistan and what is partially a Pakistani invasion of Afghanistan. I think it's something that we don't see talked about much in the mainstream media or in political circles, because we haven't quite adjusted our policy to what has happened and the extent to which Pakistan has sponsored all parts of the strategy that's allowed the Taliban to take control. But yes, I do have to declare an interest within the resistance. My father lived with Massoud in the Panjshir and across Afghanistan in the 1980s, along with Sandy Gul. And I went back, and that experience of the beauty of the country and how hospitable the people were, I never experienced as a soldier. And I always felt when I was down in Helmand or Kandahar or across the country that we as British military, American military, were very detached from the Afghan people. We didn't really understand the culture we were dealing with, the tribal structures. In the early years, our tactics were very much to just bomb everything. We took very little risk. And as a result of that, it's very obvious that we turbocharged the Taliban's resistance and turbocharged the resistance to us from the local population. So that's what inspired me to go back this year, to actually live with the people and understand the culture as my father had done, and of course as Rory Stewart had done, and many others of you have done that. And what I found is this year two very distinct stories: the pre-Biden announcement Afghanistan and the post-Biden and that withdrawal announcement Afghanistan. Now, when we went there in February, I was surprised and also delighted to find just how far Afghanistan had come along. In Bamyan, women skiing, mountaineering, taking me up the mountains, club societies of mixed sport, healthy press corps across the country. Just so much more vibrancy in Kabul, in Mazar, in Kandahar. I was shocked because I'd gone back with a very negative impression of Afghanistan, a very negative impression of that anything had been achieved. But of course, that has all been completely lost. And I don't think it was widely communicated to Britain, to America, to the West, just how far Afghanistan had developed. I think people assume that it will always be at war, it's always going to be a problem. But of course, that has always relied on Western, particularly American support. America was supporting this country financially and militarily. And the military had come along leaps and bounds since I was last there in 2012. You know, I was out on patrol with the Afghans in Kandahar and Mazar, and I was really surprised just how far they progressed. When I went back after the Biden withdrawal announcement, it was a completely different country. The morale had just had totally disappeared from the armed forces. Speaking to the rug traders around Kabul, Mazar, business had started to decline. They were talking about, could we leave? Could we help them get out? And the reason I point to this, the difference in mentality, the difference in morale, is without that Western support, this country had this centralized government had no chance of surviving, because the Taliban on the other side are and have been completely supported by Pakistan. So you have the Taliban supported by Pakistan and Afghanistan government supported by America. And if you take one of those foundations away from either side, neither can survive. The Taliban cannot survive without Pakistan, and this government couldn't survive without our support. And so we created this inevitable domino effect. Now, what I would say is, even when I was there in June, July, I did not suspect it would fall as quickly as it has done. And when I was in Kabul and Panjshir with Ahmed Massoud, and we both agreed that the country is likely to fall, and most of the country is likely to fall. What was really surprising was when Takhar and Badakhshan fell. That was when the real worry set in. But nobody, none of us predicted the speed it would happen. Now, Ahmed said to me, he believed that given that the state of the country, the fact how it's changed so significantly since the last time the Taliban were in power, that he gave them a maximum of 10 years in power until they completely collapse and we don't see the Taliban in the future. But that said, what is the state of the resistance right now? Well, clearly, they tried to fight conventionally in the Panjshir as they did against the Soviets, but before they had much more strategic depth to the north and to the east, and they are totally surrounded. And they failed in it. They don't have the quality of the fighters, they don't have the equipment, and so they failed to hold the central areas and the main roads, and they're now in the mountains. But what they represent really is a moral resistance. Their victory is a moral one, not a military one. And I think what you're going to see is, as the Taliban fail to govern this country properly, is resistance starts emerging elsewhere in the country. And that's where you may see this country fall into civil war, because right now it's easy for the Taliban to concentrate forces on the Panjshir to contain them. But as soon as they have to move forces elsewhere to curtail other riots and other reactions from across the country, you're going to see a very quick divide. But to come back to my original point, and this is a serious own goal. The government was never ever going to survive without Western support, and we have pulled that rug from underneath the people who I believe were flourishing when I saw them in February, June, July, and right now, what is the situation we face, and what are our options? Well, of course, we've got I haven't really just touched on the evacuation of people. I know everyone's given themselves pats on the back of how many people were evacuated, but there are so many left behind, and they're being hunted across the country. That's of course military commanders, NDS, who are being hunted as we speak. but it's also people that have worked in human rights, in the media. The persecution is continuing. And I am sad to say that when I failed to get any information out of our own British Foreign Office to what is the next phase, how are we going to help people who are threatened to extract? So that must be one of our priorities. I'm speaking from a British point of view, and for the Americans as well. We must continue to offer a lifeline, to offer ability to get over the border, to get people out who are genuinely at threat. Secondly, we cannot cut off aid to these people. I was in a refugee camp in Kandahar earlier this year, and it's just unimaginable conditions because of the conflict that was going on between the Taliban and the government. Now, that has been just blown up across the country. These refugee camps must be absolutely huge, and this is an absolute disaster. So it's just not an option to think we can do some sort of Iranian sanction onto Afghanistan. I then think we need to look at sort of a wider strategy and start thinking about in the future, will this Taliban government hold? I don't think they will. Are we in the West going to support a resistance movement or the resistance movement? Or are we just going to turn our backs on that? It's a very difficult decision to make because we clearly don't want to be fostering civil war. But in my view, one thing that's never discussed about Afghanistan is it ever viable to have a centralized government to control this country? Or should we have gone down a more federal route? Or controversially, should we look at, and I know this is controversial to suggest it, but balkanization, should there be a split across the country? These things have never seemed to be to me have been discussed, and I think they're important considerations for the longer term future of Afghanistan. The final 2 points I want to mention is that we went to Afghanistan to get rid of Al-Qaeda, to get rid of the Taliban. Back then, they didn't even control the whole country. They didn't control the northern areas. The Northern Alliance did. So we are now leaving a country fully under the control of the Taliban, which they weren't in 2001. And we mustn't forget the fact that the Haqqani network are 100% aligned with Al-Qaeda. Now, they may not possess the capabilities at the moment to launch complex attacks in the West, but they will do very shortly. And they've been inspired to do so because they believe they've defeated a superpower. Finally, one point I just want to leave is this blackout of comms, which has happened, which the Taliban have orchestrated to stop information getting out about atrocities. There is potentially a way out, which is this Starlink system or these medium orbit satellites, which are going up very, very soon. Elon Musk and other people are putting them up. They could potentially provide a lifeline in the next 12 months. So as an active policy decision, or to push these organizations, if we can get some sort of internet connection using satellites over Afghanistan, we can provide a lifeline for information to flow both ways, because we can't allow Afghanistan to control the flow of information of what is really happening on the ground.
Thanks, James. We've got two more speakers left, and we're getting a bit tight for time, but I think that our final two participants will answer some of the questions that have been coming in. Next up is Thomas Johnson, a research professor at the US Naval Postgraduate School. He spent a long time in southern Afghanistan at the height of the war and has had a keen eye on the American project in Afghanistan for a very long time. Thomas, thanks for joining us. I know you're keen to share your thoughts on the reasons for failure, lack of understanding of the country, its culture, its history, as James just went into, inconsistency in who to support, when and how, the fire hose of aid money that funded corruption on a grand scale, and then there's the Afghan fighting forces. So what went wrong? Unmute. There we go.
There we go. Thank you, Lynn. It's a distinct pleasure to be on a panel with so many distinguished Afghanistan scholars. I want to talk about a fairly complex issue in a very short period of time. I want to talk about why the United States failed miserably in Afghanistan. And I've got a number of reasons that I'm going to point out. But the first reason, which all the other reasons revolve around, is almost our total ignorance of the nuances of Afghanistan and the Afghan people. This started actually during the anti-Soviet jihad, when we had our largest covert aid program supporting, a couple of Sunni Mujahideen forces, but we didn't support them directly because we didn't know anything about Afghanistan. We let ISI do the bidding on where this aid went, and that holds true because even in the anti-Soviet jihad, Brzezinski, who was Carter's national security advisor, quickly suggested that we should try to turn Afghanistan into the Soviets' Vietnam, and that the only reason that we were really going to be there was to bloody the Soviets. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I don't think that even during that anti-Soviet jihad that we cared that much about the Afghan people or Afghanistan in general. It was only a year and a half after the last Soviet crossed the Amu Dari in mid-February of 1989, we basically ignored Afghanistan. And that brings me to what happened after 9/11. After 9/11, the first Saturday, Bush called together his national security and foreign affairs people to try to come up with a strategy, and I put that in quotation marks, for Afghanistan. And Rumsfeld came to that meeting with Wolfowitz with no contingency plans at all. Now think about it. The US Pentagon has contingency plans for every country in the world, but we had basically accomplished what we wanted to accomplish initially in Afghanistan. We didn't even have a contingency plan. So Tenet, and the other thing was that Rumsfeld at that time really believed in the military technical revolution. And so Tenet recognized this, was the director of the CIA, and he came and he basically ran the beginnings of the war. He got the Pentagon, CIA operatives almost immediately went into the country, and they worked with American A teams, which are basically special forces teams of about 10 people. And this was pretty easy. I mean, they lasered the thousands of Taliban soldiers and Al-Qaeda that was sitting on the Shamali plains, and the B-52s decimated them. And this reinforced Rumsfeld's feeling that we could do this just purely with our high-tech weapons. But of course, most of those high-tech weapons were useless in Afghanistan. And we could have ended the war in December and January. But we had more photojournalists at Tora Bora than we had soldiers. And we had the 10th Mountain Division sitting in Central Asia that could have been called in. One of the great mistakes we made was not to destroy basically Al-Qaeda. We brought in Afghan warlords to basically guard the border and other types of things, mistakes that we'd make over and over again. The second thing I want to talk about is that most people, when we started our campaign on October 7th, 2001, and I know this for a fact because I was with these people, most senior military and analysts of Afghanistan, and I use that word loosely, thought that we would destroy the regime by spring of 2022. That was the basic consensus after they popped the champagne bottles. Now, of course, we know that we basically decimated the Taliban regime within 6-7 weeks, and we had no preparations for what to do. So we cobbled together the Bond Accords, the Bonn Conference. And the Bonn Conference, which is absolutely American-led, absolutely was going to come out with Karzai as an interim president, ignored so much of Afghan history, culture, and other aspects. We built one of the strongest presidential systems in the world. And in Afghanistan, historically, powerful central governments have been the thing of rebellion and revolution. So we set ourselves up for basically having a government that was going to be non-legitimate. And even the way we set up the Walsi Jirga voting based on SNT, single non-transferable votes, I mean, to show you how ridiculous that was. And the reason we allowed that to go through is because we didn't want anybody to challenge Karzai. In the last Walsi Jirga election in 2000, 2018, the leading vote getter in Kabul, the largest province, got a little over 2% of the vote. And 27 of the 34 parliamentarians that were elected had less than 1% of the vote. If you want me to explain, SN, single non-transferable voting, I will, but I don't really have the time. But we created a roadmap coming out of Bonn that set up the emergency lawyer jirga in 2002, a constitutional lawyer jirga that lasted between December 2003 and 4. But the major thing is that we created a government that was not going to be successful or legitimate. The last poll I saw of Ghani's legitimacy was like 29%. Now, I never really trusted a lot of polls in Afghanistan, but he was highly viewed as illegitimate, basically because he was a very corrupt man and he blatantly stole the 2014 and the 2019 elections, which I've written on in some detail. I mean, the way he stole the 2014 election is just unbelievable. And he got rid of most of the elder people in the government and brought in his own yes men. So we had a government that really wasn't going to be supported by most of the people, as far as I'm concerned. The next thing that I want to talk about is that for the first 2.5 years of our stay in Afghanistan, and this is when we were ISAF was being created via NATO, we did not allow ISAF out of Kabul. They were responsible for securing Kabul, and we did counterterrorism. And the counterterrorism that we did violated so many of the cultural norms, bagging people at night, crashing the walls of the qalats, bringing out their women in their bedclothes. Now, I think it's oversimplification to say that Afghanistan is purely a honor revenge society, but it's very important. And our absolutely ignorant counterterrorism program helped to create Taliban members. That's the second thing. But we also never really had a strategy in Afghanistan after 2002. I mean, think about it. We conducted a war where I believe the center of gravity was the rural people. At the time we dropped our first bombs, 80% of Afghanistan was rural and 20% was urban. It's now 75-25, according to the best statistics I can find. But we tried to conduct a war out of forward operating bases, FOBs, working banker hours. Anybody that knows anything about coin, in fact, it's even in our doctrine that's specified in Army Field Manual 3-24, will suggest the only way, you don't defeat an insurgency by killing or capturing them. You make them irrelevant to the people. But we had no idea what the people in the rural areas wanted. We were completely clueless. Now, we had some combat operating posts that were near villages, but our men never spent a night in an Afghan village. So rather than clear, hold, build, what we did was clear, return to FOB, clear, return to FOB, clear, return to FOB. And the minute that we left those villages, the Taliban were back in full force. So, I mean, I could go on and on about we never really fought coin. We didn't even follow our own doctrine relative to coin. Let me rush here. Now, the other thing, everybody needs to read my friend's Greg's, I can't even think of his last name right now, the Afghanistan papers. And it will show how we and Kabul, we, the American people and the Afghan people, were lied to consistently by the United States and the Kabul regime. And some of the most important lies dealt with both the size of the Afghan National Defense Forces, as well as their capabilities. And let me give you a brief story about this. I mean, the Afghan National Police was completely useless. They were an extractive organization and one of the most hateful organizations in many parts of the country. There were some good units, but 33% of them had received no training. Even as soon as, even as late as 2 weeks ago, I heard pundits on on television talking about, how could this 275,000 defense force fail? Well, when the Taliban really started their advance, the Afghan National Army maybe had 50,000 men under arms, maybe, no more than that. And, and we knew what happened. I can talk about, we actually had a metric to judge the capability of every unit we trained. And in 2004, I got the data on that. And every one of the units we trained was judged between a 1 and a 4. A 1 meaning they could do nothing independently, they couldn't even feed themselves. And 4 meant that they could do everything independently. Of all of the units that we trained along, the bases on the Kabul-Jalalabad road, only 1 unit ranked 4 and 2 units ranked 3. So, and as Greg Whitlock suggests the American in the Afghanistan papers, we were lied to about this capacity. Let me finish up with a couple of other things. I've already talked about our combat performance. I can get much more involved in that if you'd like me to. But
we're running out
also
of
the
time,
refuge
Tom.
the Taliban had in Pakistan and the help that Pakistan gave them, especially early on and later in the conflict, was very important. But I'll disagree with anybody that suggests that the Taliban are just mere proxies of Pakistan. The Taliban are mere proxies of Pakistan. I think that that's a little naive, and I think the Taliban are much more complex than that. That's not to suggest that Pakistan hasn't had an incredible role, especially Omar knew about the refuge that he had in Asadabad, in Pashtunabad, right outside of Quetta. In fact, when ISI basically created the Afghan Taliban, it wasn't soon after they started to attack military facilities in Pakistan, and Omar completely broke off relationships because he knew.
I'm sorry, we're running out of time, so I've had to mute Thomas because we have one more.
Can I make my last point?
Okay, well, very, very quickly, if you can, because we are running out of
I'll just say also it became the forgotten war after we invaded Iraq, and finally, and possibly most important, we lost a willingness to lead. And that again was a function of our basic lack of understanding of the nuances in Afghanistan. Excuse me for taking
no,
so
but
long.
thank you very much for your time and for your analysis. It's most appreciated. But moving right along, because we are very tight for time now, I just want to remember that although it seems a long time ago, in early August, a billboard appeared on the streets of Herat with Chris Alexander's photo on it and a caption that read, "Mr. Alexander, thanks for reflecting the facts." Chris is with us. He's a former diplomat, a Conservative Minister of State, Canada's first resident ambassador in Kabul, and also served with the UN's mission in Kabul. Chris, thanks for being here. What makes you so popular in Afghanistan that you get your own billboard, which I'm assuming is no longer there, but has Pakistan got anything to do with it?
Thanks, Lynn. Great to be with you and such a great group. I've really enjoyed hearing these perspectives. And yes, I'm sure that billboard or those billboards in Herat, and I think there are a couple in Kabul, made for a good target practice for the arriving Taliban. And have gone the way of all good things in advertising into up in flames or into a rubbish bin, because things have moved extremely quickly. And it's incredibly important to have discussions like this because policy is moving or not moving in the right directions quickly enough. And discussions like this are needed to focus the resources we have, the attention of journalists, the attention of policymakers, the attention of commentators. So thank you for doing this. I want to zoom out a bit to the issue you mentioned, which to my mind is the foundational issue here. To to bring peace to any part of the world that has been threatened by terrorism in a large scale, warfare, regular or otherwise, civil war, one has to understand where the threat is coming from, what the sources of the instability are, who's training, who's funding the people that are threatening peace and security. You know, allies, NATO allies, and other democracies, when they have succeeded in bringing peace to parts of the world, have addressed the threats properly. No need to go back over the history of Europe in the 20th century, or what brought armistice to the Korean Peninsula, or democracy to Japan, Taiwan, and other places. There were strategies that dealt with totalitarian threats, insurgencies, other threats, and that resulted in peace. I think one of the reasons is that Afghanistan has never received that treatment. We've never looked in macro terms, regionally, at the sources of insecurity, the drivers of this long war. And why have we not done that? Partly because of what Thomas and others gestured at. When the US has become engaged and allies with the US, Afghanistan has tended to be part of a different conversation, a sideshow in a larger drama. Take, for instance, the 1980s, when the US and others did join forces with or finance ISI's jihad in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. You know, that really was the strategic product of Kissinger's decision to be close to Pakistan back in 1971 because he needed them to reach out to China. And then at the end of the 70s, Brzezinski's decision to arm the Mujahideen through Pakistan. But it was never about bringing peace to Afghanistan. And when the US stopped funding that effort in 1988, 89, things obviously went in very unpleasant directions. Similarly, after 2001, when the US was hit, it thought from Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was in Afghanistan at the time, although we now know that the 9/11 attacks were actually planned, operationally planned, almost completely in the Pakistani city of Karachi by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was an ISI operative through most of his professional life, a Pakistani national who grew up in Kuwait, but planned the attacks from there. The US didn't spend much time, as Thomas and others had said, focusing on what would become of Afghanistan after the Taliban were toppled. It moved very quickly on, in the days after 9/11, to discussing Iraq and the rest of the war on terror. And it really gets quite absurd when you look at something like the authorization on the use of military force, which is still in force, which is still law in the United States. Let's just recall what it says, that the president is authorized, and this was adopted, as everyone knows, on September 18th, 2001, that the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons. Now, that was used to authorize action in Afghanistan. And then it was used in the next 10 years to authorize action in 10 other countries that had played absolutely no role in the 9/11 attacks, where no one had been harbored, no one had authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks. It was a complete misfire of policy and disingenuous on the very highest level to think that that authorization for the use of military force was actually addressing the causes of the 9/11 attacks. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed planned them in Karachi. Al-Qaeda was founded in Pakistan, in Peshawar, in 1988. The Taliban were founded by ISI in 1993. Most of their leaders after 2001 were living inside Pakistan. The list goes on. And so many of those connected to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, the threat that had hit the United States and continued to hit the rest of the world in the years after 2001 were in Pakistan, yet no action was taken for at least 10 years until the Osama bin Laden operation in 2011, which led Obama to declare victory, turn the page, and decide that nothing more needed to be done. So zooming out just one more time, what has really been going on in Afghanistan? I think we have to tell ourselves the truth. This is a war fought mostly through irregular means by Pakistan for domination of Afghanistan that they started really in the early 1970s when East Pakistan, when Bangladesh was lost. And I think if you go back, Michael Semple knows this story very well. Other students of Pakistan know the story well. And look at this cadre of military leaders that have really been running Pakistan ever since. They decided they couldn't beat India in conventional war, so they needed to fight in a regular war. Obviously, Kashmir would remain a front, but Afghanistan would be the main center of effort. It grew in the 70s, gradually, grew dramatically in the 80s with the US and Saudi largesse. They flipped from backing the Mujahideen to backing the Taliban in the 90s. And then when the Taliban fell in 2001, they determined, with the US distracted in Iraq, that they were going to lie in wait and bring them back. So
Okay.
how do we,
I think we're about out of time, Chris. I'm terribly sorry to interrupt. I do want to address one question that has come in from a lot of people who've been tuning in, and that's about China's role. I guess I'd like to. Who feels that they could address that? Maybe Michael. You could say, what is it that you think China's aspirations for Afghanistan are in this? They are one of the close friends. They have declared that they will support the Taliban administration, and they look like they want to be a big player. What's your view? I'm sorry, Mike.
I found the point. Yeah, I found the button. Yeah, it's the answer is it's too early to tell. Although we've seen this initial statement of the Chinese sort of being prepared to pursue, so to be forward-leaning in the engagement strategy. They've had long history in Afghanistan. They know that the last time round, when the Taliban were in power in the first emirate, they went to Kabul to see if the Taliban were prepared to hand over the Uyghurs. In response for Chinese engagement. The Taliban said no, the Chinese didn't engage. This time round, things have moved on. However, the Chinese tend to be very cautious in dealing with regimes like the Taliban. Of course, the partnership with Pakistan will encourage them to go forward. They will again be seeing whether the Taliban are prepared to address the Uyghur issue, which the Chinese are focused on. I think the Taliban will be inclined to try and fool them the same way they tried to fool the Westerners. Of course, everybody's focused on this idea that they will somehow extend the Belt and Road, that they will secure control over Afghanistan's mineral resources, and they sort of cut a deal with the Taliban where we get the resources and we'll prop you up. I think particularly as the resistance to the Taliban grows, and this is it proves that the Taliban really struggle to do consistent diplomacy even with the Chinese. I think we'll see the Chinese actually not delivering those minerals. But as I say, it's early to tell. Do not think that the Chinese prop for the Taliban is any kind of guarantee.
Yes, and there's also the desire by the Chinese to control the flow, demand, and prices of the minerals that are present in Afghanistan, which has probably been the case with the mesonet copper deposit. So, as you say, wait and see. We're going to wrap it up. It's been a long evening, and I'm very, very grateful to you all for participating. Thank you for your comments and your patience, and we'll have to pick up a few of these threads next time we get together for the series Afghanistan 20 Years. And thank you to everybody who tuned in and for staying with us. Good night, everybody. Thanks again.